Welcome to the PA Invited Speaker lecture today. It is my honor and privilege to introduce this year's speaker, Dr. Christine Simmonds-Moore. Dr. Simmonds-Moore is perhaps the most significant reason that I'm standing in front of you today as the program chair for the 65th Annual Convention of the Parapsychological Association. Throughout a large portion of my academic and professional journey, she has been a guide, a mentor, a teacher, and an inspiration, and perhaps most importantly, a friend and a confidant. I'm grateful that she accepted my invitation to become this year's PA Invited Speaker, and I am, of course, referring to Dr. Christine Simmonds-Moore. Dr. Simmonds-Moore is a UK native with a PhD from the University of Northampton that explored schizotypy as an anomaly-prone personality. She's a professor of psychology at the University of West Georgia, where she teaches classes on parapsychology, transpersonal psychology, and other topics pertinent to consciousness studies. She has research interests in parapsychology, exceptional experiences, psychological boundaries, paranormal beliefs and disbeliefs, mental health correlates of exceptional experiences, synesthesia, ASMR, altered states of consciousness, healing, and placebo effects. She is the recipient of several Bial grants to study exceptional experiences and the author of several articles and texts on exceptional experiences. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming this year's PA Invited Speaker, Dr. Christine Simmonds-Moore, who will be delivering the lecture entitled Traversing Boundaries and Accessing the Invisible.
All right, before we start, I just want to thank Jake for that really moving introduction. It's really an honor to be invited to speak here today. And thanks to the organizers of the conference, including Jake. So I'm going to be talking to you today about traversing boundaries and accessing the invisible, which is going to be drawing from a lot of my own research and drawing from existing literature. I'm going to be focusing on talking about some correlates of psi, really with a view to understanding more about the circumstances under which psi phenomena emerge. And I'm going to be focusing mostly on receptive psi, but acknowledging that some of the correlates are similar with mind-matter interactions as well. So I'm going to basically be going back and defining psi and redefining psi. And I'm going to be looking at the main correlates and some of their attributes. And I think if we go back to the attributes, we can learn a lot about psi. So I'm mainly going to be focusing on tendencies for connection and making connections, crossing boundaries, I suppose. Tendencies for liminal experiences, so in between states like I'm experiencing today with jet lag. And also tendencies for people to represent invisible or usually inaccessible information to themselves. So you'll see some of the things that Jake mentioned emerging in my talk as I go through today, including synesthesia, which is one of my pet topics at the moment. I'm going to be really focusing on how psi might be better understood as an entangled system. And I'm going to also be discussing how we might apply a fractal lens to psi phenomena. And so this is something, again, that I've become quite excited about, and I think that fractals can tell us a lot about psi. So I will, without further ado, move on. We're going to start by going back and looking at some definitions for psi phenomena before we begin exploring some of the correlates. So on the slide, we've heard about Beman-Oniton today. We've got the classic definition by Beman-Oniton. And then we have a more recent definition by David Vernon, who is in the house, in his recent text, Dark Cognition. So both of these definitions are discussing information movement, and that psi falls outside of mainstream explanations for how information has moved. It is paradoxical by its very nature. And these definitions also remind us that psi is, in fact, a process that occurs in the spaces in between. So I think liminality is there in these definitions before we move any further forward. So what else do we know about psi? Although in our field people often talk about finding psi, I've done it myself. Psi is not a thing. As noted just now, it's a process where information is moving between different people and information, between people and the environment, and between people and their future selves. And so it often does involve multiple contributors. Psi is fundamentally liminal or fuzzy, and is associated with this idea of crossing boundaries, again by its very nature. So we've got boundaries between separate individuals that are crossed or traversed, between subjective and objective, i.e. physical aspects of the world, between the mind and the body, in addition to traversing temporal boundaries and spatial boundaries, and sometimes traversing the boundaries between life and death in survival phenomena. Psi is fascinating. And we can understand more about it by looking again at its correlates. And we do notice that psi seems to be more likely to emerge in a range of altered states of consciousness. It also seems to emerge more at the edges of attention when you're not looking. So in subjective reports, people often talk about the idea of psi phenomena sort of sneaking in out of the corner of your eye. We can also see this in research, including our own research, where we did find support for the idea that attention is perhaps usually filtering out some psi information from conscious awareness. So it's filtering relevant from irrelevant information in terms of what actually reaches consciousness. Psi also seems to work better in terms of implicit measures. It's happening outside of consciousness, but sometimes reaching consciousness in some people. So the implicit measures include psychophysiology. So it seems to be the case that psi may register first in the body and not actually reaching conscious awareness in many individuals, but instead biasing our behaviors and our mood and our actions, as noted in Carpenter's first sight model that strongly influences my own approaches to psi. So I think, again, these are some interesting places to begin. Psi seems to be outside of awareness or at the edges of awareness. Psi is like in the body, and psi is happening at the edges of attention. It's edgy and liminal. Some of you may have seen this slide before, but I like it because I think pictures can speak louder than words sometimes. I'm trying to sort of represent or re-represent what we're talking about with this idea of liminality. And so there are traits and states associated with the emergence of psi. And this is not an exhaustive list, but it's some traits on the left and some states on the right. So we've got these trait-like tendencies as well as states. And so in the past, I've discussed the idea of anomaly-proneness. And I still like that term, but I'm sure there's a better term out there. But tendencies towards having anomalous experiences. And here we're talking about anomalous experiences that actually include ostensible psi phenomena. So correlates are wide-ranging and include belief in the paranormal, i.e. the sheep-goat effect, where believers do tend to score higher than disbelievers on psi. We have boundary-related measures, or boundary-crossing measures, again, tapping into the topic of my talk. So boundary thinness is Hartman's measure. Transiminality is the best studied, I suppose, variable that relates to this idea, boundary crossing, tendencies for information to cross thresholds. We've also got positive schizotypy, which was mentioned earlier today and is really the topic of my doctoral work and a lot of work since. We have extroversion, we have creativity, dissociation, absorption, and openness to experiences. And interestingly, a lot of these traits do share variants. That doesn't mean they're the same thing, but there are some clues here in terms of the attributes that some of these tendencies, some of these traits, I should say, can tell us about psi. So interestingly, people who tend to be anomaly-prone are also more likely to have shifts in consciousness, or rapid shifts in consciousness. So I'm particularly focusing here on the boundary crossing variables, in particular transliminality. So transliminal people are really labile and perhaps move quite quickly between states in the waking day and at night. They'll experience also lots of in-between or liminal states. So again, more sort of sleepy type states in the daytime and more wakefulness at night that can relate to anomalous experiences, perhaps including psi. So there's already hints towards an interaction there. There are interactions between states and traits. And actually, that's something we're going to be looking at in our consortium. We're doing a Gansfeld consortium around the world looking at some of these ideas of trait-state interactions. In terms of states, we've got a lot, of correlation with altered states of consciousness and liminal states, particularly sleep-related states, like the hypnagogic state, which is when you're falling asleep, so you're not awake and you're not asleep. It's that in-between stage, or stages, I should say. I believe there's 9 EEG stages associated with the hypnagogic state. It's truly liminal, and it's associated with interesting ways of thinking and feeling and relating to the body. Hypnopompia is what happens at the other end of sleep when you're waking up. We've got lucid dreaming, which is also sleep-related. We have REM sleep, which is related to ESP in several studies. We have, I don't have hypnosis up there, but I should. It should say hypnosis. Meditation consistently relates to psi phenomena, and some evidence that there is ESP in some psychedelic states, and that's David Luke's work. So we have this interesting state and trait idea, and some of these tendencies share, again, these tendencies that we can learn from in terms of understanding psi a little bit better. So again, I like pictures, and I'm trying to sort of represent or re-represent to you a little bit more about what I'm trying to suggest in terms of anomaly-proneness. I mentioned before that a lot of the traits do intercorrelate. So I have one citation up there that did look at several of the anomaly-prone variables and found that they do share variance. So there's something going on there. I didn't mention sensory processing sensitivity, and that's something we're going to hear about later this conference. And I think that we don't yet know how that relates to psi, but there is going to be some news, I believe, from some of our colleagues over there in the future. But there does seem to be something interesting about some of these variables, and sensitivity is one of them. The transliminality variable, as I mentioned before, is one of the ones that has been the most systematically studied, and I think can represent a lot about what we're talking about here. There is a hypersensitivity to psychological material, and that's not just coming from the unconscious, it's also coming from the environment. And you can think about it like an extra sensitivity within the person, intrapersonally, and interpersonally with social others, and extrapersonally with perhaps the non-local environment as well with regard to psi. So people who are sensitive will say things like, oh, smells are just too potent, sounds are too loud. So you can see that in people's subjective descriptions of how they experience the world. But this does seem to relate to psi as well. So there's something there about sensitivity to various aspects of being. We're already hinting at the idea of a system and connectivity as being key. So there's generally more connections that are present in the mind and the body and just the person and how they relate to the world. And this is a picture stolen from Hartman, which I think does represent a little bit about what we're talking about with this continuum, because it's not just that someone's transliminal or not, there's a continuum of tendencies. So the bottom situation with thin boundaries is akin to a sort of transliminal, boundary thin, high positive schizotypy type person. There's a lot of fluidity, creativity as well. You can see how they share some things there. There's like a different way of thinking. It's more associational and making connections, tendencies to connect. So there's less inhibition going on in the brain, in the neural system. And generally now, transliminality is understood as being a trait that really is about neuroplasticity, which I think is a really nice way to look at this. It's about dynamic movement and connections and tendencies to connect. So those kind of tendencies also translate to the arousal system. So there's like fluidity in the states that we talked about before, more likelihood of these liminal states for people who are wired in this way, and perhaps more movement of information that could include psi. Interestingly, there's also these tendencies to connect in cognitive and perceptual ways as well, which is, again, getting into some of my own interests in synesthesia. So I've got one picture of synesthesia up there. You're going to see some other pictures a little bit later because I'm going to revisit this. So these tendencies to have fusions between perceptual qualities in syncretic cognition, including synesthesia. So synesthesia is where people have, traditionally it was understood as a fusion of senses, but it's not just a fusion of senses. It's where people might have an extra way of experiencing the world. So, for example, you might have somebody who experiences colours for musical notes, and so they will hear the musical note just like everybody. But there's an extra. There's also perhaps the experience of, I'm just going to pick a colour randomly, of turquoise when you hear a particular musical note. And again, there's individual differences in how that's experienced. So some people might have that turquoise music as a knowing, or just something flashing in the mind's eye. Other people have this amazing orchestra of colours happening out in space. There's different ways of being synesthetic, and that's really interesting in terms of understanding psi and getting at the idea that sometimes people might be able to draw information together and have a representation for something that is usually outside of conscious awareness, but maybe present, including psi phenomena. So that's an interesting tendency, I think. I mentioned other syncretic cognitions as well, and I'm going to make sure I get this right. So there's physiognomic perception, which is where people have a fusion of perception and feeling. Eidetic imagery, which is where people have a fusion of imagery and perception. So there's generally this tendency to connect information together and experience in different ways. So yeah, that's something I've been looking at in the past few years. And just recently, we've started to look at other ways of connecting as well. And so this is early days. Again, I don't know yet how intraception and ASMR relate to psi, but we are going to be starting to look at that. I reported on both of these in terms of subjective exceptional experiences over the last couple of years at the PA. So intraception is a tendency to listen to the body, and it seems to relate to consciousness. And we found that it does relate to exceptional experiences, including paranormal phenomena. So we'll see. ASMR is autonomous sensory meridian response, a bit of a mouthful. It's the head tingles, and I'm going to be talking about that more later this convention. But it seems to be synesthesia-like and has only been studied since 2015, but it's something that people experience. And we're interested in seeing, maybe that's another way to connect or experience things in the body a little bit. So we'll see. There may be, or there do seem to be state, trait, and other interactions going on with regard to these tendencies, and so other people and the environment and context play a role, and which we're going to be moving into in a minute in terms of this idea of the system. And the fact that these are different ways of connecting seems to be very fractal-like, and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about what fractals are and why they're interesting for parapsychologists in a minute. So again, pictures can speak louder than words. So I've talked to a couple of people at the conference, and they said, well, what's a fractal? And I said, well, the best way to tell you is to show you. So that's a fractal. That's a Mandelbrot. I'll, again, be talking about that a little bit more in my other very mini talk later in the conference. But I just want to draw your attention to this wonderful text on the right, which really inspired me in my thinking. And it's called A Fractal Epistemology for a Scientific Psychology by Terry Marks Tarlow. And it's wonderful. It's got a lot in there about transpersonal psychology, including consciousness and moving towards parapsychological phenomena as well. I think that fractals can be applied well to psi and make psi make sense in many ways. So I just want to say as well, this is kind of coming up really recently. I think this was published in 2020. And since that time, Mark Starlow's published a couple of other papers where she talks about fractals helping us to understand intuition. And she does talk about non-local awareness as well. And I think she's actually writing a chapter for the new handbook of parapsychology on fractals as well. So this is new and it's really cool, I think. I also want to say that Green did study fractals and wrote about fractals and anomalous experiences a few years ago as well. So it's starting to take some shape. I suppose a blatant plug for the upcoming book as well. So I have a chapter on fractals and parapsychology in an edited volume that Jake, my colleague, is editing. It's called Paranormal Ruptures. So that's coming out in September? August. Okay, August. Very exciting. Okay, so why? What are they, and why and how do they apply to psi? So fractals are sort of archetypal, but also mathematical patterns that exhibit recurring and self-similar repetitions at various scales of magnitude and across time. And I think that's quite interesting in and of itself in terms of psi. They are intriguing because they indicate that boundaries are not straight lines, but instead are rather graded and fuzzy, which may allow for boundary crossing, just as we've discussed with our definitions for psi. So psi is fundamentally about boundary crossing. And fractals are all about there being maybe no boundaries, maybe infinite repetitions. Fractals are interesting because they're a signature of life and natural forms and visible in many areas of the natural world. So they seem to be a feature of living and natural rather than artificial systems, and are explicitly visible in a diverse number of natural forms, so including coastlines, rivers, mountains, tree branches, lightning, the way that lightning branches, ferns, seashells. And moving into humans, the human cardiovascular system is fractal-like, the human respiratory system is fractal-like, the way that neurons connect to one another and the way that the brain and body work in an interconnected and multi-level system is fractal-like. So I think this is interesting. But as well, we can see that fractals are also present in a range of human behaviors. So outside of the more visible fractals, we can see them in how people are behaving and experiencing the world. So we can see fractal signatures in several altered states of consciousness, which is interesting. I see like Thilo Hinterberger often comes to these conferences, so he's an author on that paper there on altered states of consciousness and fractals. And then Varley and colleagues found an association between fractals and consciousness in different states as well. Fractals relate to creativity, and that's a core correlate of psi. And fractals are also seen in terms of relational experiences. So this is where Mark Starlow comes in. She's coming in as a therapist and talking about the relationship between the therapist and the client and the fractalness of that relationship and how we can understand that from a fractal lens and how psi phenomena might emerge in the context of that relationship. Fractals are attractive. We like to look at them, and they tend to hold our attention. And I think we might need to take this on board as we think about psi targets. So, yeah, you can see that as well in this, which you might recognize as Jackson Pollock painting. They've analyzed a lot of art and found that there are fractal signatures in artwork. And they've even analyzed films and found that films that draw people's attention in seem to have more fractal signatures, which again, I think is quite interesting. And then it is interesting as well that systems that are rich with fractals relate to relaxation and flourishing and health. So I think that's interesting as well, especially when psi is often pathologized. So if fractals can be understood, if fractals can be applied to psi, there might be something here as well. And we'll come back to that a little bit later with regard to health and flourishing. another fractal picture illustrating perhaps the infinite nature of fractals. So I wonder if the emergence of psi might reflect access to fractal-like embedded patterns that echo at different magnitudes and across time, and may allow for this kind of boundary crossing that we see in the context of psi phenomena. And Marx, Tarlow, and Shapiro wrote a cool article in 21 and suggested that these interconnections do allow for intuitive knowing in local and non-local domains. So they talk about psi. And they also suggested that fractal patterns serve as channels of resonance, and we'll come back to resonance a little bit later as well, between quantum and classical domains. So it's a really interesting idea. It's about boundary crossing and connecting things that are usually separated. And they talk about this idea of transsubjective exchanges, so the idea of this interconnection that is more than the sum of the parts between individuals, and that can be fractal-like, where there is this relationship happening. I think it's interesting that several correlates of psi performance are rich in fractals. So again, going back to the idea that certain states are fractal rich, the states that seem to be fractal rich that we know about so far include meditation, which is a core correlate of psi, REM sleep. And there was one paper that seemed to suggest that synesthesia might have some fractal signatures. And I wonder whether transliminality does as well. That hasn't been looked at yet, but I think it might, because of the way that the transliminal system is all about connection. So fractals may be implicated as well in how consciousness emerges, so how we become aware of something. So I think that's important for psi as well. And there is some work that supports that. So it follows the entropic brain hypothesis, which is from Carhart-Harris, who's done a lot of work into psychedelics and consciousness. And he's really doing some fascinating work. And then Bial and colleagues found that fractal signatures seem to emerge in this area of in-betweenness where consciousness might emerge, in this critical area that they refer to. So I think that's interesting as well. If we think about how psi might not reach awareness in everybody, but maybe it does more in some people than others. So perhaps people who are in this fractal state, or who have fractal traits and states happening, fractal connections. This is a mycelial network. I've been reading Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled Life book, which is really inspiring. And it made me really think, okay, this connects the dots as well back to fractals. So I've got a quote there from Merlin Sheldrake. This is not Rupert, it's his son. But yeah, I think we can rethink psi in terms of entanglement correlations rather than a signal that's sent and received. And that psi might work a bit like these living systems, like mycelial networks. So I liked this quote. I just put it in because I just think this book is interesting for parapsychologists somehow. So he says, all remains connected in one mycelial network. Is this organism singular or plural? I find myself wondering before I'm forced to admit that it is somehow improbably both. And so there are several systems approaches in parapsychology, and so I think it definitely is an interesting way to go. So we've got Adrian Parker's observations about psi in the Ganzfeld coming from multiple different contributors. Von Lukadell's MPI, Stanford's conformance model, and later forms of PMIR, Roll's psi system, Broad's conformance model, and Storm and Thalburn's psychopraxia, and others probably too. So there are these models out there. So von Lukadell's model, for example, connects psychological, physical, and social components that must all be considered regarding the emergent phenomena that might be internal, on the body, or out in the world. So it's also looking at how psi can happen in different ways. So I think psi might work via some kind of participation in a mind, body, and other systems. So some of this is taken from the chapter I wrote in the Greening the Paranormal book that was edited by Jack Hunter in 2019. And so again, if we've got fractals happening more in living systems, we have to think about our relationship with the environment as well as we think about psi. So this idea of mind-body-other systems comes into play. So I was thinking about psi as emerging as conversations between liminal people who have these tendencies to connect, and other components where the system is more than the sum of the parts, so like the quote about the mycelial networks. And so actually we're going to be doing some work this year at UWG. We had some funding from the Bjorkheim Foundation actually, so we haven't started that work yet, but we're going to be looking at how different connections relate to one another. So we're going to be looking at connections to the self, transliminality and interoception, listening to the body, how connections to nature and connections to social others, so how people score on an empathy scale, and psi scoring and well-being all interconnect with each other. So we're going to be doing this study with this system called Plant Wave, which basically turns plants' life signals into music. It puts it through a filter. And so we'll have people listening to that plant music and seeing whether it boosts different types of connections, so connections to the self and other, including potentially non-local connectivity as well. So we're going to be doing that this year, and we're expecting to find that those who are more connected with themselves, social others and the environment will do better at the ESP task than those who are less connected. And also that listening to plant music might help people to become more connected and perhaps boost their psi scoring as well. We also think that people who are connected in a healthy way might be those who do better at the ESP task than other people. So that's something that we're going to be working on with this idea of what I've called participatory eco-consciousness, which is really like thinking about this psi as a system idea, including fractals. I was trying to find a picture that represented synchrony, and this is what my AI came up with. And I thought, okay, yeah, music is a good metaphor, I think. So how does this interconnected and potentially fractal-like system arise? Well, I mentioned before that Marx, Tarlow, and Shapiro talked about this idea of resonance. They called it uncanny fractal resonance that happens between people who are sharing this transsubjective space. So I think that's interesting. So psi might be fueled by this idea of resonance. So resonance could be understood as this social connection, but also self-similar information and state. So people might be more similar if they're meditating together, or if they've had shared experiences, or if you have a target that really relates directly back to the person's life themselves. So this is something that you can see in some research. There was like some research by de Graaf and Cooper who looked at people who'd experienced a traumatic experience, and they found that people were more sensitive to traumatic stimuli if they'd experienced trauma themselves. So that's the idea there of this idea of resonance. So I think there are correspondences happening between parapsychological research that are dovetailing with research that's emerging from social neuroscience, and it's really quite exciting actually. There's a lot of buzz in the literature right now about this idea of synchrony, which I think is a lot like resonance. In terms of parapsychology, though, before we go to the normal, we'll start with the paranormal. So Pamela Heath had talked before about place memories and the role of resonance in place memories. And so she talked about how there is information that might be correlated with a physical space, and people who are sensitive might come into that space, and then the similar information would resonate with a sensitive person. So that's like the idea that I was mentioning before with people who might have experienced a trauma. But it could be other experiences that are self-similar, that work in a similar way. There's also lots of studies, or a few studies, probably needing replicating in parapsychology, that suggest that more than one brain can respond to the same information in EEG concordance. So people who are physically separated, so indicating some non-local knowing and relationship there. And then in the social neuroscience literature, we can see some interesting things happening, even when we're looking at people who are in the same physical space. So we can start by looking at empathy research. So Tanya Singer has done some work where she has shown that people who see somebody else experiencing pain map that back into their own system, into their own neural network. So we kind of bring other people's experiences into ourselves, and that relates to empathy. And there's other research too on that. Okay, thank you. So that's interesting. So we map other people into ourselves. So we do that all the time, and we know that that happens. That's just in the same physical space. But there's some interesting emerging research where there has been some evidence that brains are synchronizing when people are not in the same physical space, but they are connecting psychologically. So there was an article recently in Scientific American where they were talking about this idea, and finding that people who are, I think they're co-creating a story, and the brains start synchronizing as if they're one brain. And so in the article, the author is quoted as saying that when we're talking to each other, we kind of create a single uber brain that isn't reducible to the sum of its parts. And so it's again suggesting this idea of a system that emerges where people become connected. So we're talking about social resonance. There's lots of ways that you might do this, but I think it's interesting that this is happening right now in the mainstream literature, where people are talking about people being in different parts of the world and having their brains working as if they're one. And they're also seeing this happening in the therapeutic context as well. So people are connecting when the client is really sort of in a space of resonance with the therapist. So I think that's interesting. And I found one study on that, 2020. So this is really recent stuff. Ellingson. I'm getting there. I have a couple more slides. So for British people, this is Wally, and for Americans, this is Waldo. I thought that was interesting, another cross-cultural difference. So I've got a filter and some Wallies or Waldos on the slide. So this is about the healthy part of this equation. So we've already talked about how fractal-rich systems are also those that seem to be associated with flourishing and health. And I think there is evidence that psi may also be more likely to emerge within healthy systems. So in alignment with Bergson's ideas of psi being filtered, and I mentioned this before, we found support for ESP functioning like the unattended stimulus. So usually there might be a filtering of this information, including psi. So we're always doing that anyway. We're always filtering out what's relevant from what's not relevant with normal perception, but there's also evidence that that's happening for psi as well. For some people, psi information could be available to consciousness, but it might be very hard to discern it from the noise, and it might actually be overwhelming, like this image up here now, and maybe frightening if there's just too much happening. It's like sort of swimming in I suppose James's booming, buzzing confusion. You've got too much happening. For other people, rather than being overwhelmed with information, there's the ability to exhibit more control over information access, and people can dip into and out of these kind of liminal states, or fractal states perhaps. For example, Elizabeth Roxburgh's work with mediums has found that mediums can negotiate with the voices and perhaps reschedule when they might have the information interaction, as if it's a kind of metacognition or the development of boundaries. And so also we see that in healthy experiences, the information is also experienced as pleasant and it's organized because people know what to do with it and they're supported. There's a whole other tangent, but for now, we'll just say, this is in alignment with the idea of the happy schizotype that was mentioned earlier. So people who experience anomalous phenomena and flourish in spite of or because of their anomalous experiences. And there are different profiles then of positive schizotype. And it all depends on what else is going on, like how you're appraising the experiences in terms of whether it is experienced as negative or more life-affirming. I just want to say, it's not black and white here either. You're not just like stamped as healthy versus not healthy, and you can become more healthy by people normalizing experiences and having support for the development of a meaningful explanatory framework, and generally helping people to organize their experiences and appraise them more positively. But yeah, so healthy anomalous experiences, healthy anomaly proneness, seems to be about more efficient inhibition of an irrelevant size stimulus. So we haven't published that one yet. That was in our Bial report, but we need to go back to that one because I think that's really interesting. We definitely need to do some more work on how different types of system might be different in terms of how they actually work with psi information, as well as subjective experiences. But it seems like from this work that maybe the healthier people are better able to filter irrelevant from relevant information, and this was in a psi context. So definitely more research is needed in this area. So yeah, that's why the filter's up there. So there's different types of filter and different abilities to, I suppose, control the permeability of the filter. I'm going over a bit, is that okay? All right, so yeah, this is the final slide before my conclusion slide, and it's going back to synesthesia. So I promised you more synesthesias because they're fun. I love meeting synesthetes. I'm sure there's some synesthetes in the room. There usually are, and people don't always realize they're a synesthete. But yes, this is part of the picture as well. I mentioned this earlier, but we have to think about, again, this system. And, there's information moving within the system, and sometimes it reaches awareness and sometimes it doesn't. This idea of being able to represent the information to the self is really important for being able to have a tangible and meaningful understanding of the information. So it's like you have an ability to have a symbol that you can then read, rather than just something that's bubbling outside of awareness. So you can grasp it. And interestingly, synesthesia used to be thought of as only happening when people consciously perceive something, but there is evidence that actually synesthesia occurs when people have an unconscious stimulus coming into the system. And I've used this example before, but I'll just mention Berit Brogard's experience, because she is a synesthete herself and she studies synesthesia, but she has this story where she has a synesthetic response to fear, and it's like this amorphous green-grey blob that appears in her whole vision. And she has this story where she was walking out in the mountains, I think, and she didn't see anything, but she saw the blob happen. And then it's associated with fear. So she's like, okay, interesting, I'm not experiencing fear, but she had this big green-grey blob happening in front of her eyes. When she calmed down, she glanced over and there was a snake. So there was something there, but she didn't see it consciously, but it was processed unconsciously, and her synesthesia represented it back to herself. So that's a normal synesthetic experience, and I think it might happen in similar ways for psi information, so being able to sort of tangibly grasp that information. And again, synesthetes are connected. They demonstrate this same neural architecture of being interconnected, very, very sensitive, and then they have stronger representations generally for weak information. We have found some evidence for synesthesia as an anomaly-prone personality. I did a psi study with synesthetes and didn't find anything overall with the BEM precognitive memory design, but I did find post hoc that associators, people who have the colour in the mind's eye, did better at the memory task than projectors who have the colour out in space. So that's interesting, and more needs to be done with that. And we did find some interesting anomalous interactions in our psychomantium study that is in a study that is under review at the moment. So that will be coming out hopefully eventually. But yes, there's something interesting about synesthetes. As well, some work I did with Nancy Zingroni and Carlos Alvarado found that the synesthetes were fitting the healthy anomaly-prone personality type as well. So they were, the people who are able to have anomalous experiences and be healthy and flourish, rather than people who are disturbed by their experiences. That was associated with well-being and definitely fit that cluster. So yeah, I think that's another place to look further for where we can boost psi. And then I think I mentioned before that there was that one paper recently that was looking at fractals perhaps in the context of synesthesia. So again, that's another link back to the fractal idea of this entangled system. And this is my final slide. So yeah, so I've been talking about psi as a system. I've been looking at the idea of correlates, giving us some interesting clues. So psi is fundamentally liminal and seems to be associated with crossing boundaries. And I think that a fractal lens provides a good metaphor and model for psi phenomena. And again, the talk I'm giving, I think on Sunday, is a self-study where I actually tested myself after watching a Mandelbrot Zoom versus a blank screen. I'm not going to tell you the results now, but I will say it was interesting. So I think it's a good metaphor, and I think more work needs to be done with that systematically. Systems approaches should consider individuals, states, and contexts with this idea of a liminal system. And we need to be thinking about encouraging healthy liminality and connections, perhaps richness in fractal structures like meditation. So in this kind of idea of a mind-body signature that's healthy ways of connecting. Boosting resonance and synchrony between the various contributing parts of the system. So for example, think about targets that might resonate with the person and having people meditating together and things like that we talked about with regard to resonance. So I think future research should certainly go into the idea of fractal inductions as well, because I think that's interesting and possibly, why not? Why not play with it? I had great fun playing with fractals and psi myself, and I think it might also lend more insights into subjective experience as well as psi. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry for going a little bit over. And this is a picture of Melson Hall, which is where I'm based at the University of West Georgia. And yeah, I think we do still have time for a few questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Christine, for delivering the invited lecture for the PA convention. Questions for the presenter?
Hi, Christine. Just wondered, could you tell me what meditation and REM sleep have to do with fractals? I don't really understand that.
I think it's about what's going on in the brain. And again, I've been trying to look at all the literature. As soon as I got obsessed with fractals, I just dove in. And it just looks like there are fractal signatures emerging in the neural signatures, and that's happening more in states that are associated with being conscious. So consciousness itself, but also states where people are more aware. So meditation is where you're very aware. REM sleep is associated with dreams, and you might be more likely to remember your dreams, particularly in a psi context. So I think it's just seeing those kind of signatures. And again, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm just drawing from this literature and trying to pull it together. But I just thought it was interesting that there are certain states that do and certain that don't. So you're not seeing fractal signatures in non-REM sleep, for example, which I thought was very interesting. When you think about how dreams can happen all through the night, but they're much more likely to happen in REM sleep, and that's where we see a lot of psi experiences happening as well.
Just to clarify, you mean in EEG?
In the EEG and other neural measures, yeah. I can send you the papers if you're interested. But yeah, I was just looking for fractals and pulled everything I could find, and yeah, there's a lot of buzz and things coming out in the last few years on that too.
Other questions?
Pardon the naivete of this question, but how do fractals relate to holograms?
That's a very good question, and I don't know.
Okay, I'm not alone then, but it looks similar to what I see pictures of holograms, so I was wondering if They were related in some way, or
They might be. Okay. That might need to be another deep dive into the literature and obsession. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, Christine, you've successfully, I think, made links to, well, normal psychology, and I think that's politically important. But if you look at the deeper implications, the more theoretical implications of it all, what does it really mean? You know, how can we explain this? And I'm wildly associating to, if you remember David Marks, the critic, he used to be one of the major psi critics, but he was overwhelmed by his own synchronicities that he eventually gave a lecture last year at the SPR in which he admitted there's no normal explanation for this. We would have to seek Jungian psychology almost to explain this and synchronicities and so on. Have you considered the deeper theoretical implications of all this way of looking at psi? Because I think it would actually, you may create links with psychology, but it would overthrow the currents of neuroreductionism in psychology.
I mean, I think you have to start somewhere, and you know, finding links that are suggesting the same thing is interesting. I don't know. I hope that some of the people who are more grounded in non-psi approaches might consider that something else might be going on. That's why I think that Thilo Hinterberger's work is interesting. I mean, he's not talking about psi in that paper, but you know, he's somebody that's very sympathetic to psi phenomena, and he's doing the neuroscience work. But yeah, I don't know. I hope that it does create some kind of normalizing. I mean, anything could probably go the other way as well. But my hope is that it normalizes psi a little bit more and helps people to develop more healthy ways of experiencing these kinds of phenomena, whether they're genuine psi or not. Like some parts of it can be more neutral in terms of how to be a healthy, flourishing person and still have these experiences. But yeah, so I think that's the way I'd go with that. Like, so people could go off the rails and see too much meaning, but that's where you're going into, where are we going? Into that. So maybe he's seeing too much. And, you know, that's where I'd say, well, you know, maybe he could use some of the healthy states like meditation to kind of gain more control and mindfulness and develop metacognition to be able to be more healthy. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, I mean, I'm trying to connect between mainstream and parapsychology, and I do think that this text has just been, where is it again? This is a really important book, and it is, you know, it mentions the paranormal experiences in it, but it doesn't really go too much down the rabbit hole. But it's very, very interesting. I don't know how much this has been accepted in the mainstream either, but I just found it fascinating and inspiring.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and then some important information about dinner and the presidential address later on. One more question.
I want to ask a sort of piggyback question from the last question. When I see fractals, I think of like more traditional wisdom. And I was wondering if there's anything that could be learned from that, like mandalas, like some of the Eastern traditions, or if they should be kept separate.
I mean, I think that a lot of mandalas are fractals. You know, I think especially a lot of the images of fractals in nature are really, you know, very similar to those kind of ideas. So, and you know, it's going back to people's experiences as well, because people have those experiences, and Jung was having those experiences of the mandala to represent his own development of self. And so I think, yeah, maybe it's a fractal way, or he's seeing his own unconscious, which is fundamentally fractal-like. So maybe people are able to see their own unconscious when they're accessing these connected states and tapping into fractal ways of knowing.
Thank you, Dr. Simmonds-Moore. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. We have a, yes, round of applause. All right.